Good morning, everyone. I'm Aaron Thompson, and I'm really excited to be part of this grassland conservation discussion. If you're listening to this video, it probably actually means that my wife has had our daughter, and so I'm not actually there physically, but I've enjoyed being part of this deliberation as we've kind of gone through the last few weeks, really thinking about a question that I think is absolutely critical as we start to think about kind of this larger scale understanding of grassland conservation efforts at a time where the landscape is really changing on us here in the upper Midwest. And so I'm going to spend about the next 25 minutes giving you kind of a brief overview of why I've gotten involved and kind of some of the research that I've done that I think can help inform this discussion. To begin, I just wanted to share with you that, as a natural resource planner or a landscape planner, my particular areas of expertise are that I've spent a career kind of working in community-oriented planning, certainly with a collaborative planning emphasis, but my graduate training is actually in natural resource social science, and so this applied social science component of planning. And so a lot of this just responds to this notion of grassroots, stakeholder-driven planning, right? And in the rural landscape, this becomes a really critical part of what we're up to. The three areas that my programming really does touch is this notion of collaborative planning, and this cuts across a lot of different spectrums. And so I do everything from kind of watershed planning, I do some habitat work, I do forestry planning, but I also cross over and I do green infrastructure work as well, and so some urban development issues certainly sneak into the work that I do. Again, I approach this as a social scientist, and within that, a lot of the work that I do is really is about generating community conversations that lead to enhanced capacity to respond to environmental challenges. Kind of here in the bottom right, I also threw up a Wordle, and to be honest, this is my doctoral dissertation. And just to kind of give you an understanding of this is that the focus on landscape planning in the agricultural landscape, working directly with farmers, is something that is very near and dear to my heart. And to be honest, it's the reason that I think I'm here having this discussion today, because when we talk about grassland management, we're getting into a lot of these really challenging questions about competing economics, competing priorities of grassland or of rural agricultural landowners' priorities. And so I ran a test version of this seminar with my undergraduate students a week ago, and we took an hour and a half. And so I figured what I'd go ahead and do here today is I just wanted to start with some conclusions. I've been doing work with agricultural producers and understanding this work. This dates back to my time at Purdue, really working with Linda Prokopi's Natural Resource Social Science Lab, trying to understand what's motivating farmers to get involved in rural landscape planning efforts. And there's some key lessons that I really wanted to share with the group, and so I wanted to start here this morning. And so I think the absolutely most important thing I wanted to share is that we need to learn as resource managers, as wildlife biologists, as professionals trying to work in this landscape, that we need to meet farmers where they're at, right? Creating the opportunities for dialogue, rebuilding relationships, right? This is inherent on us, right? And the expectation has been reversed in a lot of ways, and that's a challenge we have to get over. The other part of this, lesson too, is really thinking about this, recognizing and responding to diversity. So many times doing this work, I have people come to me and they talk about good apples and bad apples, and and they're referring to farmers or some version of this where there's some distinction that draws a line between them that is based on some arbitrary information that people have heard. It's significantly more complex than that. Even the ownership patterns are changing underneath our feet right now, and we need to understand that there are other things occurring than just our narrow focus on conservation, and that's got to be part of this discussion as well. We also need to get farmers involved. So lots of discussions. I'll talk briefly towards the end about farmer-led councils. This seems to be somewhere where we're really growing. This practice seems to be, kind of tied into how do we get farmers engaged in this work. Certainly the reading that I shared with you that was recently published in Ag and Human Values that you guys have for today focuses in on this, understanding what it takes to get people motivated to get involved in these efforts, and I think that's something that's really critical. We have to get them to the table. And then the last step here is really directly tied to this. If we're not willing to share some of the decision-making authority, share the burden and the responsibility of conservation, but also the success and the accolades and everything that comes with it, if we're not willing to share that with farmers, this isn't going to be successful. Perhaps this slide is more about keeping me on track than it is for you, but I just wanted to say I've kind of broken this down into three sections. And again, within a lightning talk, I'm trying to be as short as I can. But it comes down to this. Why do I study grassland management? I want to dive into that for a second. Then I want to talk about this notion of disproportionality, because I think the ecological modeling work that we're starting to see coming out of this grassland discussion, but also kind of the social side of this notion that some areas were going to be more successful. So the spatial problem-solving aspect of this is so critical to me. And then I want to jump into some of my current research and some of the work that I've done specifically with producers, but also in a grassland context, and talk about community capacity building there. So why am I, as a natural resource planner, interested in grassland management? Because big changes are coming to the landscape. And so again, when I think about this and I work at this landscape level very frequently, we're starting to make these, develop an understanding of the trends that are influencing farmland here in Wisconsin. I've also done some of this work across the Midwest, certainly looking at the spatial modeling behind this. But just to give you a picture of what we're seeing here in Wisconsin, a little more than 10 million acres in cropland, and so this would be production in a variety of forms. About a quarter of that's actually in pasture-based agriculture. However, over the last 20 years, what we're seeing is about a 22,000 acre a year loss to urban development. And then what we saw, in kind of the corn boom that we were seeing from 2003, and then really it's just started to let up here in the last couple of years, is that more than 100,000 acres of pasture was converted to row crop production. Or corn production, primarily for ethanol here in Wisconsin during that time. And so again, these are major changes occurring in the landscape. This is what's drawing my interest. But some of my interest in grassland management is actually the result of it being in my backyard. I've been here at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point this is my 6th year. And one of the projects I was, early on that I was asked to kind of get involved in, just to help with some facilitation on, is the Central Wisconsin Grassland Conservation Area. And this happens to be the last home of the greater prairie-chicken here in Wisconsin, a bird, a species that was once found in every single county here in Wisconsin. And I don't want to get into all the specifics on it, but this is what's bringing me into this, is that right here in the center part of our state, we have this mixed grassland production, forested landscape, right, with lots and lots going on. It's an interesting area with interesting partners, and as you'll see here in a minute, a lot of issues that relate to the human dimension side, which is why I've been asked to get involved. And I don't want to spend too much time talking specifically about the greater prairie-chicken. This species really has served the grasslands here in central Wisconsin very well in terms of kind of being, well, it's the umbrella species. And a lot of other species benefit from this management efforts related to the greater prairie-chicken. However, as you can kind of see in this graph, the trend has not been good for this bird. And we've seen, even in recent years, we're seeing a contraction in habitat that's pretty dramatic, just in terms of where we're seeing this bird on the landscape. And so one of the areas where my research is plugged in, this is actually one of my grad students who just finished up in the spring, starting to take a look at, well, what are the causes of this? Historically, what are we looking at? Here in Wisconsin, we're somewhat limited by land cover availability in GIS to about 1992, and the DNR came out with the first really high-resolution land cover data set. But if we go ahead and look back to that time, what we're seeing across central Wisconsin, across these 7 counties, we had about 1.25 million acres in grassland. As of 2010, we saw that number drop to about 1 million acres, so we lost 250,000 acres. And you can kind of see here on the right, kind of on the top, that 18% loss in grassland habitat. Again, the things to note there is a lot of this conversion, almost 60% of this conversion, is due to succession of forest coming back in. Some of that could just be removing the grazers, removing grazing from the landscape, and then the land's doing what the land naturally wants to do. This wasn't a historical grassland. But when you go down within the area that's more intensively managed for the CWGCA, what we're seeing is we've lost about 50,000 acres of grass. So against the backdrop of a 70-year-old effort to save the greater prairie-chicken, in the last 20 years we've lost 50,000 acres of grassland. That doesn't bode well for the long-term management of the species. And not to dwell on the specifics of the management plan too much, because we're actually in the process of starting to think about what the next management plan should look like since the last one's expired. But a lot of the emphasis the last go around was on engaging landowners. How do we get the farmers involved in this, right? How do we work creatively? That's words that jump in. How do we look at coordination and communication with partners? Long story short, this didn't happen. It didn't happen in a lot of ways. There was a very explosive meeting that I happened to be a facilitator at, where the best outcome that we could come away with was we stopped the yelling. Right? Conflict is part of this landscape, and this was amongst producers who very much supported keeping this bird on the landscape. And so the DNR relationship is a very complex one. There's a lot of and it's not just DNR. A lot of agencies are struggling with how to work with producers in this landscape. Again, this slide's probably as much about keeping me on track as anything else, but I just wanted to bring this together. When I talk about natural resource planning or as a talk about landscape planning, a lot of this is about how do we combine different elements together. And so I talk about this from the notion of balancing multiple demands. Working in this landscape requires understanding the notion of multifunctional benefits of agricultural lands, right? The production goals, the wildlife goals, the recreation goals, right? There's a lot of different commitments, a lot of different stakeholder groups that play in these. We also have to understand that there's a spatial problem solving component to this. Ecologically, there's going to be some areas that it's more beneficial, right? Restoration efforts are going to be more successful. Conservation efforts are needed in one area more than in another area, just based on the characteristics of the habitat that's available. And the last part of this is bringing people into this, understanding what's driving behavior. These are critical. They're all big questions. Complexity is part of what we do. So a lot of the work that we talk about here is understanding this notion of targeting, right? And the science of targeting. There's been a lot of work, and GIS has allowed us to do amazing things on ecological targeting, right? Understanding, and again, we've seen some of this from the new model that's being developed by Dan and others here that are presenting as part of this discussion, right? That out of the world of possible locations for conservation, we can model the physical characteristics of that landscape to understand what are those properties that we should be spending our time. I make the argument, and others have made this argument, that we can extend further than that. Once we've figured out where the priority landscapes are at, we need to understand the social conditions within those landscapes in order to select which landscapes we're going to be more successful. Where are the willing landowners at, right? Where does the capacity exist? These are major questions that we need to be able to answer, and that's the hope that we can get there with some of the work that I'm doing. So the model I'm presenting here is actually a little bit more complex than the one that was in the reading for this week. And so this is a model that I've been working on developing since I was a grad student. It kind of comes down to me to a couple of those key distinguishing variables that we need to understand, both at an individual scale, but also when we aggregate up to larger groups, right, within a targeted subwatershed or within a targeted grassland management area. Trying to understand the environmental motivation, so farmers' views of the environment, and we can talk about these as different dimensions that focus on kind of the stewardship aspect versus kind of this related dimension of the farm as a business. But there's also this other component that exists in this landscape, and this is something that comes out very clear when you get out and work with farmers, is this notion of government involvement. This partnership with government agents is one of these really critical components of this. And what we find is that some producers are more supportive and some are less. And right, some of this has ties to individual property rights, some of it has ties to past experience, right? Some of it's about resources, right, and trust. These are all factors that come into play. But generally, this is what I'm trying to understand when I start looking at the social dimensions of what's motivating farmers to get involved in these efforts. And again, landscape planning requires social science, and there's a couple different components to this. But we certainly, understanding the attitudes and behaviors of the stakeholders involved in our process is critical to natural resource management. That's kind of a fundamental aspect of what we're talking about here. But the other part of this is that landowner attitudes are also inherently spatial. And so I want to spend just a couple of slides talking about how we can bring that component in. I'm not going to delve too much into the method, but I do want to just go ahead and bring this slide up. Talking about farmers, understand that farmers' ownership patterns are not like they own a house and then that's the area of their influence. Their land ownership is spread out across the landscape, in some cases very distant across the landscape, depending on what farm fields they control, manage, or in some cases just lease out to others. So one of the things that I've incorporated into a number of surveys is the ability for producers to track their land ownership. And so in this particular example, we actually went after where do they own land across the landscape, where are all their fields that they control, and we're able to build that back into a GIS database. And so I just want to show you a quick application, right? So if we have a landscape, and this actually happens to be Tippecanoe County back in Indiana, and this is part of a study I did there. But you have a landscape, and in this particular landscape, we're looking at the forested habitat. There's not much. This is a county that is more than 70% row crop agriculture. But here are the existing habitat areas, and we can do quality assessments. We can do a lot of spatial work with this. But if we're able to then overlay attitudinal data, and think of this as willingness of landowners to get involved in a process, right? We have a metric that understands where the quality habitat is. We can begin to overlay where willing landowners are, or landowners that support the same goals of the initiative that we're involved in, right? This is that notion of targeting. And in an ideal situation, this would allow us to be able to go ahead and zoom back in and pick out the properties, right? Where are the parcels where we have the most support? Again, this might be for conservation, but it might also be able to then layer this in with parcel ownership and look at the potential for expanding, right? We have a landowner that has a high quality piece of habitat on their property. They have some land that would be suitable for conversion to add to that core block of habitat. And we know from their attitude surveys that they're willing to get involved and support this. All right, to go ahead and end this morning, I did want to go ahead and circle back to some of the work that I've been doing in the Central Wisconsin Grassland Conservation Area. And so I had the opportunity last spring, kind of on a limited budget. We were able to steal some money away from the DNR just at the last minute to fund this study. We were able to do a small scale survey of producers that live within the CWGCA to start going ahead and assessing some of these same variables I've been talking about throughout. Again, the emphasis here was really about trying to understand how do we change future management plans, right, to adapt to the needs of producers in this water or within this management area. And the emphasis with this study was really on producers that owned more than 120 aggregate acres within the CWGCA boundaries, and we also went ahead and screened the properties to ensure that they were less than 50% forest cover. And so again, trying to zoom in on those that are most likely to have grassland on their property. We ended up getting about a 36% response rate back from this. Again, it was about what we expected based on the limited funding that we had available for this, but it means that we got 112 responses, completed surveys back to kind of feed into this study. And because everybody likes to start with the demographics and understanding, I'll just go ahead and lay this out. I do a lot of these surveys, and we see that across the Midwest there's a lot of commonalities, and there's just not a lot of variation in the demographics. But I'll run them again because they are what they are. We look at producers. What we're seeing is the majority of them are men. In this case, more than 90% of the respondents were men. Most of them are 60 years or older. We see some slight variation across the landscape about gross farm sales, but this is also one of those questions that that we have a problem getting people to respond to. They just don't like to share that information. Again, we see, in this particular landscape, we actually saw lower levels of education than we've seen in others, but again, that was amongst the who responded, that's important. But really what we were aiming at wasn't the demographics, because when we don't have variation, it doesn't help us understand conservation behaviors. What we were trying to understand is that, beyond who responded, what are these distinguishing variables that can help us manage in this landscape? And so I'm going to talk about how we focused on kind of conservation approaches and getting their feedback on various approaches on the next slide. But, once we've done that, and we can use that as a grouping variable to kind of break apart the different producers within this watershed, we can then start to understand and respond to the different goals. What I mean by contacts is that who is the trusted source of information that can go out and meet with them. And then approach, again, ties back into all of this, is that we're starting to explore some common approaches, the status quo of kind of agency-driven decision-making versus looking at farmer-led councils or township-based interest groups, moving to one-on-one contact. Where are the preferences? Where do they lie with these producers? And so again, working with my grad student, we were able to run a method. It's called inverted R. It's based on a paper I published in Field Methods a few years ago that allows us to actually take a set of 16 Likert type items, so this is strongly agree to strongly disagree items, and break them down using a factor analysis process, not to understand kind of the different items that load together, but the different individuals. And so this shares a lot in common with a Q method approach for those of you who might be familiar with that. But what we were able to learn here is in this particular landscape is that we found 3 different groups. And so group 1 is this dominant group. Almost 70% of those who completed the survey came out as kind of based on how they view the efforts to address issues affecting grassland loss in central Wisconsin are more likely to be successful if, and again, there's 16 responses to that question that they rated. Again, the people in group 1 shared common agreement and common disagreement across that. And so we're going to talk about them in more detail in the next slide. But there are differences across these groups, and this method helps us understand kind of where these key differences exist. And so again, we've highlighted these here. The ones that really jump out, are listed here at the bottom of the screen. But for group 1, again, the one I'm focusing on for right now is that what made them different from the other groups is that they are strongly opposed to the idea that decision-making be left to officials who are locally elected with assistance from experts at the state or federal level. Again, this ties back to this notion of government as a partner versus kind of this need for individual property rights. Certainly these are interrelated in many ways. And the last step in this method is that it allows us to go in and use the statements to go ahead and develop kind of a description of this group. And so we came up with group 1 being kind of the individuals. Again, 68% of the population fell into this group. And what we see here is that the defining characteristics is that the government needs to listen to people who are getting their hands dirty in the farming world. They shouldn't just dictate what is going to happen, and they disagree with others who think a formal board is needed to advise local government. They also seek freedom to implement individually tailored solutions. So what we're seeing from this group, this dominant group in this landscape, is that they want their opinions to be heard. They also want them heard in a more one-on-one setting. And again, this has implications on how we have to approach managing the resource within the central Wisconsin grassland conservation area. And again, presenting this whole research within a lightning talk is impossible. And so I just did want to go ahead and pull up a concluding slide to talk about this, though. Again, I'm focusing here on group 1 in red. And so these individuals, and so this is that once we've established who they are, who they kind of group together with in terms of the other producers, we asked them questions that allowed us to reveal approach, right? And so this approach went across a variety. We asked them about 4 different approaches, and what we came back with them is that their preference is that they need a one-on-one based approach, right? They want someone to come out and talk to them about management on their land. That's how they want to be approached. As we look at the other groups, we see that farmer-led councils and some more variation in this certainly exists. But again, 70% of or 68% of those who responded need this one-on-one approach. Contact also is an interesting part of this. What we saw here was that there's a preference amongst group 1 to work with more locally based partners, and they're much less inclined to work with the DNR. Again, 70% and DNR doesn't need to be front and center in these efforts, right? They need to look to county government. They need to look to nonprofits that are working in this landscape, because DNR is not the preferred contact point. The last part we touched on is goals, and we looked at a variety of this, and I'm just bringing one aspect to this. We compared support for grassland habitat management to support for long-term management for the greater prairie chicken. And what we saw universally across all groups is that the support for grassland management is significantly higher than it is for the greater prairie chicken. That's a huge challenge. And so, it's part of it is in our work with the DNR, since we got some of these preliminary results, is that how do we start to change the messaging? How do we change who's sending the information out? And how do we change kind of the emphasis within that to move away from the focal species and move towards grassland management more holistically? And then I wanted to leave you here with just a couple of slides that talk about kind of the key lessons coming out of this survey work. What we're seeing here is that effective collaborative conservation in this landscape is going to require a shift to more locally tailored, intimate models between farmers and conservation partners. And lastly, that conservation in this landscape is going to require a broader coalition of partners and more boots on the ground, or we will miss out on landowners that support efforts to preserve grasslands. Again, this is something that I've seen in my interactions with the producers in this landscape. It's something that I've seen elsewhere, is matching the right partner to the landowner is a critical aspect of this, and it's something that we need to something that we certainly need to incorporate as we start looking to develop communities of practice for grassland conservation here in the upper Midwest. And finally, I hope I'm here to be, I hope I'm there on the 9th to be part of this discussion, but if I'm not, certainly feel free to contact me if you have further questions. I hope it comes through, I really enjoy working with producers. I really enjoy working in this landscape to try and understand how we can get groups of stakeholders together. There's a lot more work that goes above and beyond this. I have jokingly called this my year of surveys, as I basically haven't, not had something in the field with a group of producers or another key stakeholder group here in central Wisconsin, and realistically cutting across our state here in Wisconsin. And we keep learning more and more about this all the time, and I love the fact that this seminar is bringing some additional attention to how we can bring an understanding of individual behavior, an understanding of community capacity, an understanding of social networks that fit within that into this discussion about how do we save grasslands moving forward.